Hey guys, today I'm going to be covering Chapter 1, The Rise and Expansion of Islam from A History of the Modern Middle East by Cleveland and Bunton. So starting off in the pre-Islamic Middle East, before the rise of Islam, there was the Byzantine Empire, who were successors of the Caesars, and their territory included Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and parts of Iraq. There was the Sasanian Empire of Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. The Byzantine Empire of the West and the Sasanian Empire of the East weakened as they began fighting over territory, which is like the age-old tale of the decline of empires fighting over territory. In the Byzantine Empire, citizens were dealing with high taxes resulting from constant warfare, as well as religious persecution once the empire adopted Greek Orthodox Christianity. The Sasanian Empire was going through similar religious issues with the lack of a unifying religion once the state adopted Zoroastrianism, which ultimately alienated the Jews and the Christians of the region. So just a quick note, Zoroastrianism was the primarily monotheistic religion of Persia pre-Islam. Zoroaster is the prophet of the one true god Ahura Mazda, who is in constant battle against the evil rival Agramenu. So the idea is that each person has freedom to choose between good and evil, and a person's choices would affect his destiny in the afterlife. So, did your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds? And hopefully they did. So you had the Byzantine Empire, the Sasanian Empire, and then moving on to the Arabian Peninsula, and with the exception of Yemen, which at the time was a fertile region that was able to support a settled agricultural society. The Arabian Peninsula was a vast desert home to ancient Semitic nomadic people known as the Arabs or the Arabs. And unlike the empires surrounding it, the Arabian Peninsula did not have a central government. Rather, there were a number of tribes who governed their own people. Most of these tribes practiced various forms of animism, which is the belief that non-human entities possess spiritual essence. So we're talking inanimate objects, plants, and animals. And one thing that's interesting is, although there were different languages spoken amongst the tribes, there was a common language that could be understood across the region. There was a special type of poetry that was spoken at communal gatherings known as the qasida, and this became really important later on in the spread of Islam because it meant that the Prophet's message could be told in a language that people across the region could understand. So Arabia became an important commercial transit route between Middle Eastern empires and Yemen, but the wars of the Byzantine and Sasanian empires disrupted that route and gave rise to a route through Hijaz, which is a region in present-day Western Saudi Arabia. This trade route was really beneficial to Mecca, as Mecca became the most important commercial center of Arabia. Mecca was also a religious site holding the Kaaba, which at the time was a shrine of an animistic cult, and attracted worshippers throughout Western Arabia, and it even became an annual pilgrimage site. During the time of the pilgrimage, warfare was suspended and the Kaaba became a neutral ground, giving tribes the opportunity to resolve disputes. Moving on to part 2, Muhammad and the Foundations of Islam. Islam is also a monotheistic religion, which means submission. So theoretically, those who practice Islam have submitted to the will of God. The Prophet Muhammad was revealed the messages of Allah, which is just a direct Arabic translation of God, and he shared these messages with his people. All of these messages would later be collected to form the Quran, which represents the direct words of God and his commandments. Similarly to Zoroastrianism, the good and bad deeds committed during one's lifetime would be weighed on the Day of Judgment and would affect them in the afterlife. So 40 years before the conception of Islam in 570, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, which means Muhammad the son of Abdullah, the future prophet of Islam, was born. He was orphaned at 2 and raised by his uncle Abu Talib and worked in caravan trade. In his early 20s, he married a wealthy widow by the name of Khadija, who is held in high regard today in the history of Islam, as she really held down the fort for Muhammad, and she was the first to convert after him to Islam. Together they had 4 daughters. Around the time Muhammad was 40, he began leaving Mecca for days at a time to meditate, and during one of his meditations, he received his mission as a prophet through divine revelation from God through the angel Gabriel. Gabriel told Muhammad that he was to recite the divine messages that he had received to his fellow Meccans. This event is known as the Night of Power in Islam and marks the beginning of a transformative time when you had all these different religions being practiced in the area to having one unifying religion. So after Muhammad received his prophetic mission, he began preaching in Mecca and even criticizing the leading tribes of Mecca. So naturally, this did not go over well, and he began experiencing a lot of opposition and threats of physical harm. So an invitation came from Medina, which at the time was known as Yathrib, for Muhammad to be a mediator. Representatives of Medina promised protection to Muhammad and any Muslims who followed him. The immigration in 622, immigration with an E, from Mecca to Medina is known as the Hijra, which also marks the beginning of the Muslim calendar. Muhammad spent 10 years in Medina, and during that time, he became the head of a small state, and his status rose throughout Arabia. The shift took place through a combination of preaching, negotiations, and warfare. He eventually was able to convince the authority of Medina to embrace Islam, but he still faced opposition from the Jewish tribes of the area. So, naturally, he expelled these tribes out of Medina, took their property, and redistributed it amongst the Muslim immigrants, with an E. Islam became heavily intertwined in the city-state that Medina eventually developed into, covering issues of debt, marriage, inheritance, economic practice, and the such. Muhammad eventually set his sights back on Mecca as he wanted to bring them into the expanding Ummah, which means community. So he ordered raids on Meccan caravans, the first of which actually took place during one of the months of the sacred annual pilgrimage to the Kaaba, which, if you remember, during these months, warfare was prohibited and was a neutral ground. These acts were justified to Muhammad through divine revelation that sanctified warfare against unbelievers and designated all Muslims who spread Islam through force of arms as deserving of special merit. After a series of confrontations, Meccans eventually began to accept Islam and swear their allegiance to Muhammad, as they saw the probability of his success becoming a reality. So in 630, Muhammad led 10,000 men to the doorstep of Mecca, offering to spare its inhabitants so long as they surrender the city and accept Islam. The Quraysh leaders of Mecca agreed, and Muhammad was ultimately victorious. Shortly after, the animistic idols inside the Kaaba were destroyed and eventually became a focal point and pilgrimage center for Islam. That is, the Kaaba did. So 2 years after conquering Mecca, Muhammad died, leaving behind the issue of successorship, as he had no sons. His companions named Abu Bakr, a fellow companion, as the Caliph, which means successor, and the new head of the community. Abu Bakr was succeeded by Umar, who began the era of the expansion of the Islamic Empire into Byzantium and Sasanian Iran. Following Umar was Uthman and then Ali, who was the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law. So within 100 years following Muhammad's death, Arab forces had reached from the Indian subcontinent to Spain and part of France. The spread of Islam and the Arab conquests were so swift because, as a monotheistic religion, Islam fit into the existing religious traditions of many of the areas it conquered. Islam also became more tolerant to non-Muslims than the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, as the Quran commands Muslims to protect the people of the book, which includes Jews and Christians. However, this tolerance was eventually extended to the Zoroastrians of Iran and the Hindus of the Indian subcontinent. So many of the people living in the new Islamic empire were non-Muslims, known as dhimmis, D-H-I-M-M-I-S, who were allowed religious freedom, but were definitely never considered to be equal to Muslims, as they had to adhere to special rules, such as not being able to join the military and having to pay a special tax called the jizya. This tax became an important source of state revenue. This revenue was one of the reasons why Arabs didn't really encourage conversions in the first century of their rule. That, along with the idea that Islam was exclusively an Arab religion. This idea is going to be referred to as Arab exclusivism. So when Ali was chosen to succeed Uthman, his main focus was on the equality of all Muslims, both Arab and non-Arab, and for leadership to remain in the house of Muhammad. Ali was murdered in 661 and succeeded by Muawiyah, the governor of Muslim Syria, who even contested Ali's rights to the caliphate years before. Muawiyah founded the Umayyad dynasty. This dynasty was plagued with the issues that resulted from Arab exclusivism. As the non-Arabs became disgruntled with the discrimination they were facing, they eventually overthrew the Umayyad house. Following the Umayyad dynasty were the Abbasids, who adopted a universalist policy that accepted the equality of all Muslims. Something that's interesting is that as more time passed from the Prophet's death, the leaders of the empire moved farther and farther from the humble way of living that he practiced. By the time of the Abbasids, the caliphs lived in luxury and considered themselves shadows of God on earth and ruled as kings. But in the Abbasids' case, the territory of the Islamic Empire was just far too big for a single monarch, and North Africa slipped from its territory. And that concludes chapter 1. If you guys are interested in me posting just a quick recap video, like 2 minutes long, I definitely will be posting that for you. So thanks for watching. Hope that was helpful to some of you. Thanks.